Summer 1969, the Vietnam War rages, and US astronauts have taken the first steps on the moon. Black radicals call for an uprising, bringing racial tensions to boiling point, while 400,000 people crowd the Woodstock Festival to celebrate 3 days of love, peace, and music. But on the other side of America, just outside Los Angeles, a group of hippies living on an abandoned movie set called Spawn Ranch are planning a terrible end to peace and love. Charles Manson, self-proclaimed messiah and leader of a group he calls the Family, prepares for a murderous rampage.
He's just a very evil, sophisticated con man. Manson had this ability to dominate, but he also wanted to murder. And when you find both of these characteristics, which independently are unusual, but when they coexist in one person, then you have a Hitler type, a Manson.
And the idea was to commit horrible, horrible murders that would incense the white community, so the white community would think that blacks committed the murders, and then they would go down and start killing the blacks.
Manson sends 4 of his most trusted followers on their first mission. 23-year-old Charles Tex Watson, 21-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel, a choir girl, Linda Kasabian, 19, a hippie looking for Jesus, and Susan Atkins, a 21-year-old topless dancer and call girl. Around midnight, they arrive at number 10,050 Cielo Drive. This house in the exclusive Benedict Canyon area of Bel Air is rented by Roman Polanski, the acclaimed Polish filmmaker, and his 26-year-old American wife, Sharon Tate. Polanski is in Europe. Tate, who's just returned from London, is 8.5 months pregnant. That evening, she has several friends keeping her company. Abigail Folger, 25, an heiress to a coffee fortune. Her boyfriend, actor and playboy Wojtek Brokowski, 32, and 35-year-old Jay Sebring, the ex-boyfriend of Sharon Tate. Charles Tex Watson cuts the phone lines and the intruders climb an embankment by the front gate. Before they reach the house, they meet 18-year-old Stephen Parent, a friend of the caretaker leaving in his car.
Watson told the 3 girls to get back in the bushes. He went up to Parent and he had a 9-inch bunt line revolver, and Watson shot him 4 times at point-blank range in the upper body, killing him.
Leaving Linda Kasabian outside as a lookout, Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel enter the house through an open window to execute Manson's plan.
So frightening, so nightmarish that there were over 100 stab wounds. The victims were screaming and begging for their lives. 2 of them ran out of the residence and were pursued.
Susan Atkins was standing guard on Sharon Tate, and Sharon Tate was crying and begging, please, please let me have my baby. All I want is to have my baby. And Susan Atkins looked her in the eye and said, look, bitch, I don't care a thing about you. I don't care whether you're going to have a baby or not. You're going to die.
They weren't just carrying out Manson's directions. They seemed to enjoy it. They killed with a certain amount of relish or gusto.
As they leave, they scrawl the name Pig on the wall in Sharon Tate's blood. Early the next morning, the housekeeper stumbles on the carnage. The police are called. Mike McGann is one of the first on the scene.
Went through the property. We first saw Stephen Parent, who was slumped over in his vehicle. I saw Wojciech Wojciechowski on the front lawn. He had been badly stabbed many, many times. Abigail Folger was probably 75 feet to the south of him on the lawn. She had been stabbed numerous times. And then we went into the residence, and we observed Sharon Tate, Polanski, and Jay Sebring lying in different positions in the living room portion.
That afternoon, headlines around the world run stories about these high-profile murders. They call it the crime of the century. Hollywood's glitterati are terrified.
Sale of guard dogs went up dramatically overnight. Stores that sold firearms in Beverly Hills that would sell 3 or 4 a day suddenly were selling 200 a day. Security services, they were multiplying their personnel.
The next night, Manson plans another evening of terror. This time, he will join in, but there is also a new family member, former high school beauty, 20-year-old Leslie Van Houten. It is Sunday evening. After several hours driving around, Manson's family come to 3301 Waverly Drive. "44-year-old Lino LaBianca, who owns a chain of shops in the area, and his wife, 38-year-old Rosemary, have just returned from a holiday.
Mr. LaBianca was on the front sofa reading the Sunday paper while Mrs. LaBianca was in the bedroom getting ready for bed, and Manson and Watson came in, got the drop on him, kept Mr. LaBianca on the sofa, then brought Mrs. LaBianca out, tied their hands, and assured them that they weren't going to be harmed, that this was only a robbery.
Then he comes back to the car and he sends his killers in there. And he told them to make the murders as brutal as they were the previous night. So he sent Tex Watson in, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Kremlin. And then he, Susan Atkins, and Linda Kasabian drove off. At the time of the murders, they were having a milkshake down the road.
Patricia Krenwinkel, after the murder, carved the word war on his stomach with the carving fork, and then plunged the carving fork into his abdomen. And then Krenwinkel took a towel, dipped it in his blood, wrote the word rise above the inside part of the front door, wrote death to pigs on the living room wall, and wrote helter skelter on the refrigerator.
And then they proceeded to raid the refrigerator, ate after the murders, before they left, and then they hitchhiked back to Spawn Ranch. No one connected the two murders. When I say no one, many people did. The LAPD did not.
Although there were some similarities, we really did not connect them at that time.
Now the well-to-do of Los Angeles go into a panic. Journalists scramble for information, reporting rumor and innuendo as fact.
The town was terrified, particularly the celebrity crowd out in Beverly Hills. They were going into hiding because not just the brutality of the murders, but the randomness of it.
On November the 18th, 1969, 3 months after the murders, there is a break in the case. Susan Atkins, who is in prison as a suspect in an unrelated murder, has boasted to her cellmates about the details of the Tate LaBianca murders.
Both of these cellmates had the good sense to call the police and tell them about what Susan was saying about how she had been involved in these murders and how Charles Manson was behind them.
The police now have suspects for the horrific killings. Detectives interrogate Susan Atkins. At first, she agrees to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Police then issue an arrest warrant. Manson, who is already being held on other charges, has been a well-known lawbreaker since childhood.
He says that he is the creation of the prison system. Manson's mother was a prostitute, and when he was 4 years old, she was sentenced to state prison for armed robbery. From age 4 to about 8, he was raised by his grandmother, and pretty much from the time that he was 8 years old until the present. He's either been in boys' camps, state prison, federal prison.
The police round up the rest of the suspects. The apparently normal middle-class backgrounds of the Manson family is a surprise. Charles Watson is from a small town in Texas, an all-American boy who did well in college. Leslie Van Houten is from California. She was a school prefect who'd gone on to business school. Patricia Krenwinkel, age 21, is the daughter of an insurance executive and at one time had wanted to be a nun. Linda Kasabian is from New Hampshire with her young daughter. She's drifted around the country in search of religion. Susan Atkins, nicknamed Sexy Sadie, is the wildest. She's a local girl and the only one with a criminal record.
There was a tremendous pressure, at least the LAPD felt, to break this case. And the chief, Ed Davis, called a press conference saying that the case had been broken and we were going to take it to the grand jury.
Vincent Bugliosi, one of the lead prosecutors, isn't ready to take the case to trial. Lawyers share Bugliosi's concern that a murder case against Manson would be difficult to win.
Manson was not at the murder scene. He did not participate in these murders, and yet he was the main defendant. So I had to connect him with the murders, bring him in by way of circumstantial evidence and the law of conspiracy, which provides that each member of a conspiracy is criminally responsible for the crimes committed by his co-conspirators.
The prosecution claimed that Helter Skelter, the Beatles song, might be the motive behind the crimes.
What they would do is they would take LSD and listen to the Beatles' White Album. All the members listening to it on acid determined that the Beatles were sending a message to black people to rise up and to start a revolution.
Manson was an eclectic, and he borrowed his philosophies from everyone. The Beatles, the Bible, particularly Revelation 9. He could quote it verbatim, and he connected the Beatles and Revelation 9. The angels in Revelation 9 and the locusts appear to be one and the same, that the earth is going to be invaded by locusts. So he said, there's no question, the Bible's talking about the Beatles. These locusts were going to have breastplates of iron. Manson said that refers to the electric guitar of the Beatles. And what's going to issue from their mouth is going to be fire and brimstone. These are the lyrics of the Beatles.
Manson preaches to his followers that the Beatles are sending him messages in their music.
There's a song in the Beatles' White Album called Blackbirds. Blackbirds singing in the dead of night, take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life you've been waiting for this moment to arise. Well, the murders, the Tate LaBianca murders were done in the depth of night. Inside the front door in the LaBianca house, written in Mr. LaBianca's blood, was the word rise. And you know, the Blackbirds were the black men.
The songs that influence Manson most are Helter Skelter and Revolution.
Helter Skelter talks about going to the bottom and coming back up. There's a bottomless pit in Revelation 9. And in Revolution 1, at the very end, the lyrics on the jacket, the Beatles are saying, if you want a revolution, you can count me out. But Manson pointed out, when you listen to the record itself, after the word out, very quietly, you hear the word in. So he told his followers that the Beatles were once undecided on whether they wanted a revolution. Now they did want a revolution. And they were speaking to him and other tuned-in people beneath the lyrics of their songs.
But Bugliosi still has to connect Manson directly to the murders.
There's no way in the world that these people would have gone out on their own and committed some of the most horrendous murders imaginable without his direction and guidance, because he controlled their daily activity.
Now the prosecution suffers a major setback. They lose their main witness, Susan Atkins, who'd originally agreed to testify against Manson and the other defendants.
A part of the agreement was that at any time in the future she could retract everything she said and I could not use it against her. And that's exactly what happened. She went back to her god, Charles Manson. So whatever she testified to at the grand jury, whatever she told me, we could not use at the trial.
The prosecution's chance for a conviction is looking hopeless without an eyewitness, but their luck turns as another defendant, Linda Kasabian, who was the driver on both nights of the murders, agrees to testify in exchange for immunity.
She had enough testimony to give me that these were the people who drove to those residences on the key nights.
We felt much better about giving her immunity because she really was not involved in participating in the murders. We didn't want to get Susan Atkins immunity because she was definitely a participant in the cold-blooded murder.
On the 15th of June 1970, the Tate LaBianca murder trial is finally underway, but jury selection has been difficult due to press coverage.
The first time I walked in the courtroom and saw that it was Charles Manson and the three girls, and the courtroom was cram-packed full of people, and I said, oh, brother, what am I doing here?
It was clear. He couldn't get a fair trial in Los Angeles ever.
Paul Fitzgerald is a public defender representing Charles Manson and other members of his family.
Manson said, well, I'm not going to play cards with these people. I'm not going to play their game.
I told Manson before the trial started, I said, Charlie, I'm going to convict you, but I said, after you get a fair trial.
Spectators and reporters jam the courtroom.
I felt most of the time like I was in the midst of a carnival. Manson would be orchestrating the girls what to do, stand up, sit down, what to say in unison, which was great because that played right into our hands because our theory was that, you know, he was controlling people to do his will.
As Manson holds court inside, his family keeps vigil outside.
I'm waiting on this corner till Charlie gets out of jail.
Then, Linda Kasabian takes the witness stand.
She testified in excruciating detail how these homicides were committed, who was where, what she saw, who had a knife, who was stabbing who. She was, without question, the most important and significant witness in the entire trial.
At this point, 2 months into the trial, everyone is stunned as President Nixon publicly declares Manson guilty.
Here is a man who was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason.
This made headlines all over the country. The main headline, LA Times, Manson guilty, Nixon says. Someone brought that paper into court. Manson got a hold of it and stood up in front of the jury with a silly little childlike grin on his face, showed the jury the headline, as if he was almost somehow proud that the president had taken notice. That created a real problem. There was an immediate motion for a mistrial.
The President of the United States says somebody's guilty. What recourse do you have? You answer the question.
We had to voir dire the jury, each one of them under oath, as to the effect, if any, the president's declaration had on their state of mind.
They asked everybody if they could put it aside and continue, and everybody said yeah.
Manson starts to threaten the judge, the prosecutors, and even the witnesses.
Manson, on another occasion, armed with a pencil, tried to jump the counsel table and get to the Judge Older to stab him.
The bailiffs immediately tackled him, dragged him out of court. He said, in the name of Christian justice, he shouted out to the judge, someone should chop off your head. From that day on, by the way, Judge Older carried a .38 caliber revolver under his robe.
When Linda Kasabian, the prosecution star witness, was testifying, at one point I saw Manson, while the lawyers were at the bench, Manson looked at her and gave her this throat-slitting motion.
This was not a whodunit. This was a whydunit. My hope was to try to explain why this was done, not that they didn't do it.
In a moving wind-up speech, Bugliosi evokes the memory of the victims. The press call it the roll call of the dead.
Each name, I said very slowly, to remind the jurors what this trial was about and to think of those victims. They were human beings that wanted to live just as much as they did, or anyone in the courtroom. As they from their graves, they're crying out for justice.
After the prosecution rests its case, The court wonders what Manson's defense can possibly be planning.
A psychiatric defense should have been interposed. No question about that. Any fool could see that. I saw that obvious. And I had presented many psychiatric defenses in the past. The defendants would not permit it.
The three co-defendants, Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins, asked to testify in an attempt to exonerate Manson. He also asks to testify. The courtroom is in chaos.
The defendants demanded the right to testify in their own behalf and confess to the crime, made judicial confessions to the jury. And I didn't allow them to do that.
The judge finally allows Manson to testify, but without the jury present. In his own bizarre way, Manson dismisses the prosecution's case.
He just wanted, I think, to testify really for the benefit of the press, so he could tell the press what was on his mind, but he didn't want to have to be cross-examined in front of a jury.
On the 15th of January 1971, everyone is surprised as defense rests without presenting a case. The fate of Charles Manson and his co-defendants is now in the hands of the jury.
I couldn't conceive of these people coming back with a not guilty verdict. But I could conceive of possibly a hung jury.
On the 25th of January, after a week of deliberation, the jury reaches a verdict. Security is tight. Manson family members threaten to disrupt proceedings on what they call Judgment Day.
Finally came in with a verdict of guilty.
The guilty verdicts are flashed around the world, but sentences are yet to come.
Same judge, same jury, same courtroom. New issue. Should these defendants receive life imprisonment or the death penalty?
Manson and his women shave their heads and make threats in the court.
All three of them took the witness stand, confessed to the murders, said all they were doing was killing pigs and clearing up the air over L.A., and tried to exonerate Charles Manson.
Although Bugliosi feels certain Manson will get the death penalty, he is not sure about the three women.
I told the jury that if this was not a proper case for the imposition of the death penalty, no case ever would be. And I challenged the jury. I said, if you're not willing to come back with a verdict of death in this case, then we should abolish the death penalty in the state of California.
We deliberated approximately 3 days on the death penalty, 3 or 4 days. It wasn't difficult, really, for any of the defendants except Leslie Van Houten, and because of her lesser involvement, only being involved in the second night of murder.
On the 21st of April, the jury returns with a decision.
We were very happy when they came back with the death penalty on all four defendants.
It was kind of a thing, well, that's over. Now we don't have to listen to any more about why they did it or who they were or why, or, you know. So it kind of helped put it out of our minds.
Manson is sent to death row at San Quentin Prison. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten await execution at the California Institute for Women. Charles Watson has been tried separately, convicted, and also given the death penalty. After 9.5 months, the Tate LaBianca murder trial is finally over. The killers will, it seems, pay for their crimes in the gas chamber.
A year later, a California Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, violated the Eighth Amendment. They made their ruling retroactive, and everyone on death row around the country, including Manson and his co-defendants, all of their death sentences were irreversibly reduced from death down to life imprisonment.
In those days, there was no life without possibility of parole. It was just straight life. And straight life meant that you were eligible for parole in 7 years.
I don't believe that any of the family, whoever they might be, has paid their debt to society. I believe they should have been executed as the jurors decided.
We relied a lot on the justice system, and now we're wondering, what is our justice system? That these people could have committed these heinous crimes And every couple of years, our family is subjected to having them go before the parole board and say how this and that, and how nice they are now, and how they're born again, and all of this kind of thing.
Stephen Kay attends every parole hearing to fight against the release of Manson and his co-defendants.
I feel that the victims need a voice, and if I wasn't there, there wouldn't be anyone to remind the board of the horrible things that went on August 9th and 10th, 1969.
Although it's unlikely that Manson will ever be released, there is a possibility that one of the Manson women might be paroled.
Someday they may get paroled, not Manson, but and probably not Watson, but the others maybe. I hope Adkins and Krenwinkel are never paroled. They're still very dangerous individuals. Van Houten will probably at some time get a parole.
The chance that Leslie Van Houten might get parole has prompted Alice LaBianca to get involved.
When I heard that Leslie Van Houten was coming up again for parole, I was pretty shaken up about it, and I have always wanted to do something short of actually going to the parole hearings. And it was suggested to me that I could write a letter to the parole board.
Leslie Van Houten's most recent review was in May of 1998. Van Houten is now a dignified 48-year-old and has always been a model prisoner.
This is going to be a subsequent parole consideration hearing for Leslie Van Houten. At your last hearing, there was a great deal of conversation regarding the crime involved in you, which was the murders of Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca.
Yes.
When did this suddenly hit you that what you had done was such a horrible, atrocious crime?
I'd say it took a few years here in the isolation unit that they had the women on death row in.
Was that after your death sentence had been overturned?
Yeah. Also that kind of kicked it in. When it was no longer the matter of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and I realized that I would be living with this, and I better learn how.
Okay. What I want you to do now is direct your attention to Mr. Giaquinto, who's going to talk to you about your institutional adjustment.
According to the board report, you've been involved in group psychotherapy. You've completed electronic data processing. Anything else we should know about what you've been doing the last couple of years?
Well, I've been in therapy. I was in one therapy group prior to this hearing.
Okay. Now have a closing statement from the district attorney.
Thank you very much. I am respectfully asking you to again find Leslie Van Houten unsuitable for parole for two main reasons. One, she was a very active participant in two of the most senseless murders, I think, in the history of American crime. Mino and Rosemary LaBianca were totally innocent people. They were in the supposed sanctity of their own home, and they were literally butchered by Miss Van Houten and the others. And you know, this was not some lost soul that didn't know exactly what she was doing. Miss Van Houten made a decision in her own mind that she would participate. So, a very active participant. That's one reason that I think she should be found unsuitable. The second reason that she should be found unsuitable is because even though I think the psychiatric report this year is more favorable than it was in '96, I don't think it's totally supportive of her release on parole. I would respectfully ask the board for a 2-year denial.
Thank you. Ms. Van Houten?
Yes. I have a closing comments that I would like to make. I will be the first to admit that this was a cruel and callous and dispassionate crime, which is basically why I'm found unsuitable, and it's the one thing that I can never change. I would like to point out that there are what I feel certain circumstances that allow me to be able to sit in front of you and hope that someday I will be released. I believe that the psychiatric testimony that offered that I was not as capable as I am today in 1969 is one reason that I could be considered for parole. The second thing is that the crime was committed during an unusual period of time not to reoccur. I was 19. I was a drifting hippie already with a history of using marijuana. I ran into a man who had just gotten out of prison, was very seasoned, and enjoyed using people. I've worked very hard in my therapy to understand that relationship and to move on from it. The third thing is that during the committing of the crime, that I was under extreme mental stress. I today have a stable social history. There's nothing I can do to change the past. Certainly there is not. But I would hope that you would understand that I took the wreckage and I have tried to become a person that is contributing.
The LaBianca family wishes to have the attached two-page personal letter to the Board of Prison Terms read into the record as allowed by statute. And it says,
We must make a statement about the parole hearing for convicted murderer Leslie Van Houten. Leslie Van Houten chose her own path. She chose to follow the instructions of Charles Manson. She chose drug-crazed killers as her family, and she became one of them. But what about my family? When do we get our parole? When does Lino get his parole? Sympathy for these killers, and especially this one, is misplaced. Sympathy, understanding, and compassion should be given to the victims of murder and not the killers. As Miss Van Houten continues her incarceration, let her continue to remember that what she did that fateful night was forever. The Manson family mark on this society is deep as the stab wounds to their helpless victims. Signed, Alice LaBianca.
After a brief recess, the parole board returns with its decision.
It'll be a one-year denial.
1 year?
1 year. The panel finds what I'd like you to do for the next 1 year is to remain disciplinary free.
Thank you.
I think that you're doing well. However, the seriousness of this crime is something that is very difficult to get around.
This is the best review Van Houten has ever managed. She will have another hearing in 12 months. She now has a good chance of parole.
Manson, in a very curious way, has beaten the rap. Manson, at the time of these murders, was 34. 17 out of those 34 years had been spent in jails, reformatories, and prisons. He's totally institutionalized. He doesn't mind prison life. That's his home.
Most legal experts doubt that Charles Manson will ever be released from prison, but by law he's entitled to a parole hearing at least once every 5 years.
These parole hearings are a joke. We all know Manson's not going to get parole. Manson knows it too.
Manson comes to the parole hearings because he loves to have reform.
Manson, who is now 64, has come up for parole 9 times. Of those, he's attended 7 hearings. The most recent is this one, from March 1997.
Gentlemen, if I could ask you to take your glasses off. Thank you.
We're on, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, we're on the record. This will be a subsequent parole consideration hearing for Charles Manson. ID number is B33920. Do you have any preliminary objections before we start?
Well, yeah, I have a lot of objections, but no one's ever been interested before.
Okay, do you swear to tell us the truth today?
Always.
All right, that's all I asked. All right, I've got some stuff to read here, so I'll be a minute. We'll start with offense summary. Says shortly before midnight on 8/8 of 1969, Manson informed his crime partners that now was the time for helter-skelter. Crime partners were directed to accompany Charles Tex Watson in order to carry out Manson's orders. Crime partners were Linda Kasabian, Susan
Where's
Atkins.
this coming from? Who's writing this?
This comes from the probation report from when you first came into the system.
Well, it's a little distorted.
Did you want to tell us your side of this?
Yeah, I've been wanting to for years, but it just it wouldn't listen.
Okay, this is your opportunity if you want to tell us, as long as you don't take too long.
Yeah, well, the more confusion that people have piled on me with lies and deceit and ambition and all the greedy little things that they play their dollar bills for comes back to the penitentiary that I've been in since I was a little kid. So I look at everything from a child's perspective because I'm still 10 years old, because I've still been up underneath the authority of the father since I was a little 10-year-old kid, because when my mother got out of prison, she brought me over and let me loose with the monks in the Irish Catholic Church.
Are you responsible for these murders?
Responsible for life itself.
Okay. We'll consider that your response. This is a report, a psychiatric report that was prepared for this hearing. And Mr. Manson, I'm not going to read all of it. I'm only going to read parts of it.
Yeah.
As usual, inmate Manson spoke in metaphor and allegory, and on occasion had to be reminded to be more linear and concrete. He has a clinical history of exercising control, manipulation, and power over his associates and followers, fueled by narcissistic rage for real or imagined slights and disrespect taken literally by his followers as license and license to kill. He appears resigned to the present condition and position, and at his last departing comment to this examiner was, "This is a better life than an old folks' home."
All right. Mr. Van Court will talk to you about your parole plan.
If down the line you were actually given a parole date, what would your plans be?
I would go poof,
Poof.
poof.
Now, I noticed that in the most recent future plans, it says residence, Manson offers no plans for his future.
I don't have a future, guy. I never had a future.
Any questions, Mr. K?
No questions.
Closing statement?
Yes. Finding Charles Manson unsuitable for parole is the easiest decision that you'll have this year. Mr. Manson and I both know that he will never be suitable for parole. Mr. Manson masterminded, and he's never quite understood the law of conspiracy and aiding and abetting, and that's why he thinks that he's not guilty.
I didn't have nothing to do with killing those people. Period.
Okay.
I've told you that all the way down the line. I wasn't around anyone when they were killed. I'm not saying I'm not capable of doing it myself.
Okay.
But I'm just saying this. I did not do that. And I could have proved it in a court of law.
Mr. Manson, Mr. K did that.
Okay,
So I'm
all right,
ask you
yeah.
to interrupt.
Mr. Manson masterminded 9 of the most brutal, senseless murders in the annals of American crime. I think Mr. Manson is clearly unsuitable for parole, and I would respectfully ask the board for the maximum 5-year denial. I wish it could be longer, but the law only allows for 5 years, so that's what I'll ask for.
After a brief recess, the parole board returns with its decision.
Prisoners denied parole for 5 years. Hearing panel finds it is not reasonable to expect that parole would be granted at a hearing during the following 5 years, and the specific reasons for that finding are as follows. Prisoners participated in 9 murders. Victims selected at random to fulfill his idealistic dream of helter-skelter. As a result, a longer period of observation and evaluation is required before the board should set a date. That concludes the hearing, Mr. Manson. The time is approximately 2:50.
All right, let me have a little tag on this if I can. I accept this decision. That's cool. What I'd like for you to do in your own minds personally, everybody that has a personal mind of their own, could possibly consider that the longer that you let this conviction stand and this little helter-skelter scheme of the district attorney to get his particular reality over into the play, that's going to be the reality that they're perpetuating. That's not the reality that I'm perpetuating. I'm not saying that I wasn't involved. I'm saying that I did not break man's law, nor did I break God's law. Consider that in the judgments that you have for yourselves.
Thank
Good
you,
day.
Mr. Manson.
Thank
Good
you.
day.
Public obsession with Manson has lasted for 30 years. Vincent Bugliosi is now the author of a book about the Manson case called Helter Skelter.
The very name Manson has become a metaphor for evil. Manson has come to represent the dark and malignant side of humanity. And again, for whatever reason, human nature, people are fascinated by evil.
In today's counterculture, some young people have come to idolize Manson again, giving him cult status.
To some people, Manson has become a hero. But these are people on the jagged margins of our society. You know, we're talking about the neo-Nazi, skinheads, people like that. They look upon him as the high priest of anti-establishment hatred.
An entire cottage industry has grown up around Manson.
He has a thriving business going on now, selling things over the internet. He sells autograph shirts, photographs, and other memorabilia.
There are several Manson websites, ranging from his conviction and murders to pages that exhibit his artwork and music.
Manson receives more mail in prison than any other prison mate in U.S. history.
We cut our hair, we did it together. Everything we do together.
The question that's never been answered is, how was Manson able to capture the minds of young people and get them to kill?
He was not a heavyweight in our world, but there's no question that in the world in which he moved, the dropout, offbeat world of the hippie, he was a heavyweight. Kids just naturally tended to congregate around him, and within a short period of time, they were following him.
He would give them lectures every night after dinner. He would give them like sermons, talking about different things. Adolf Hitler, the Black-White Revolution, the Beatles.
And he realized that I've got all these people following me, and they'll do whatever I tell them. So I think he used them, he exploited them to get even with society.
Even if Manson did not actually murder, his name will forever be associated with America's most notorious serial killers.
Serial Killers takes a short break now, but returns in January. Next tonight, from factual to fictional horror. Stand by for details.